The church was silent except for the heavy sound of mourning. I stood near the front pew, my hands folded around a small black clutch, the fabric of my long black funeral dress brushing softly against my ankles. I was 70 years old, and this moment was already painful enough, burying my last remaining sister. But then, like a blade through my chest, I heard the sharp voice of my daughter-in-law, Tessa, echoing louder than the priest's words. "Oh my God," she scoffed, nudging the woman next to her, "look at what Eleanor is wearing. That cheap old thing looks like something you'd find at a thrift store. No class at all." Her laugh, cruel and deliberate, sliced through the air. Heads turned. Even the children stopped fidgeting. I froze, feeling the sting of humiliation burn hotter than the tears in my eyes. This was the last place I expected betrayal, my own family, my son's wife. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My heart thumped against my chest, and the walls of the church seemed to close in on me. I looked down at the dress I had chosen carefully that morning. Simple, black, elegant. Chosen not for show, but for the dignity my sister deserved. I had worn it years ago for a charity gala, but today it carried no trace of glamour, only grief. Still, the way Tessa's words rolled off her tongue made me feel small, stripped bare in front of people who should have been offering comfort. The air felt heavy as whispers rippled through the pews. I heard one woman mutter, "Shame. Her daughter-in-law shouldn't speak like that." But most just stared, waiting to see what I would do, their eyes darting between me and Tessa, like spectators at a cruel play. Tessa leaned back in her seat, arms crossed, wearing a smirk of satisfaction. She was 32, polished, the kind of woman who wore designer handbags and posted every moment of her life online. I could see the shine of her manicured nails as she gestured dramatically to her friend. "Some people don't know when to step aside with dignity," she added, her voice still carrying. "If my mother-in-law cared about appearances, she wouldn't come out in that rag. Funerals are no excuse to be, well, tacky." The word tacky hung in the air like poison. She wanted people to laugh at me, to confirm her superiority, to remind me of the invisible line she thought separated us. My son, Michael, sat beside her, eyes fixed on the floor, silent, complicit. That silence broke me more than her insult. My cheeks flushed, not from shame but from the ache of betrayal. I had spent decades pouring my life into my family, sacrificing everything so Michael could go to college, so he could marry the woman he wanted without worry of money, so they could live comfortably in the home I helped them buy. Yet here I stood, mocked in public by the woman I had once welcomed into my family with open arms. The church that should have been a sanctuary now felt like a courtroom, and I the defendant, accused of being outdated, irrelevant, disposable. I swallowed hard, fighting the lump in my throat. For a second, I thought about walking out, but then my sister's photograph caught my eye. She would not have wanted me to leave my own farewell in shame. The whispers grew louder. Some looked away embarrassed, while others leaned in as though savoring the scandal. I caught sight of my niece shaking her head, glaring at Tessa in disbelief. The priest cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to continue the service, but the damage had been done. I could see Tessa's satisfaction grow as she saw my silence. She mistook it for weakness. She thought she had one. But what she didn't realize was that silence, for me, was not surrender. It was a shield, a way to let her dig her own grave with her cruelty. She didn't know the truth of who I was or the weight of what I carried beneath the folds of this cheap dress. I lowered my eyes and smoothed the fabric with trembling hands, remembering where it came from. That dress was no thrift store find. It was custom, made by one of the most sought-after designers in New York, part of a limited collection worth $50,000. But that detail was never meant to be known. To me, clothes were never about price tags or labels. My late husband Richard used to tell me, "Eleanor, real class isn't about what you wear, it's about how you carry yourself." I believed that. I lived by it. But standing there, humiliated, I could feel my composure waver. And yet, beneath the sting, another thought pulsed. Tessa had no idea who she was mocking. She didn't know that I wasn't just Michael's aging mother. I was the woman who had quietly built the very company that signed her paycheck. The service dragged on, each prayer and hymn coated with the bitterness of what had just happened. Every time I dared glance up, I saw Tessa's smug expression, her whispered commentary, her need to be the center of attention. She didn't grieve my sister. She didn't respect this moment. It was all about her, about proving that she was above me, that I was nothing but a faded shadow in her perfect, curated world. I pressed my lips together, forcing myself to stay calm. I reminded myself that grief had taught me patience, that endurance was a kind of power. Still, a part of me ached with loneliness. I wondered if anyone would come to my defense. But Michael stayed still, a coward bound by her influence, and that silence spoke louder than words. When the final hymn ended, we filed out toward the graveyard. The cold autumn air bit at my cheeks, grounding me. As the casket was lowered, I whispered my goodbye, letting a tear slip free. But Tessa's voice cut through even this sacred moment. "Maybe next time, Eleanor," she said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "you should let me help you shop. God knows you need it." A few people gasped. My hands tightened on the clutch until my knuckles ached. I turned to look at her, really look at her, and for the first time, I didn't see a polished woman. I saw arrogance, insecurity, and ignorance wrapped in designer clothes. She smirked again, waiting for me to crumble. But instead, I drew a long, steady breath. The game had changed. I straightened my shoulders, lifting my chin with quiet dignity. "Thank you for your advice," I said softly, my voice calm enough to silence the whispers around us. "I'll keep it in mind." My words confused her. She had expected a fight, tears, an outburst. Instead, she received composure, and that unsettled her. I saw the flicker in her eyes, the first crack in her armor. She thought I was too weak to stand up to her, too old to matter. She couldn't have been more wrong. Because while she laughed at a dress, she had no idea that the future of her career, her marriage, and her entire image rested in my hands. What she didn't know was that 2 days earlier, I had already signed her termination letter. Her arrogance was about to cost her everything. As I walked back toward the car, the autumn wind swirling leaves around my feet, I let the pain of the moment settle into resolve. I would not let Tessa's cruelty define me, nor would I allow her to believe she could trample over me without consequence. She saw an old woman in a plain black dress. But soon, she would learn that quiet doesn't mean powerless, and humility doesn't mean weakness. My sister had always told me, "Eleanor, you were born to lead. Don't ever let anyone forget it." As I slipped into the back seat of the waiting car, I glanced one last time at Tessa, laughing with her friends. A bitter smile tugged at my lips. Little did she know, the ground beneath her was already crumbling. And I was the one who had set the cracks in motion. I wasn't always the woman people overlooked. Before wrinkles lined my face and silver threaded through my hair, I was Eleanor Grace Whitman, a girl from a small Ohio town who dreamed bigger than her neighbors thought proper. At 21, I married Richard Whitman, a man with a quick smile and sharper ambition. We didn't have much, just a small house with peeling paint and a kitchen that smelled like coffee grounds and dreams. But we had each other, and that was enough. In those early years, I worked 2 jobs while Richard pursued his degree in business administration. I ironed shirts late into the night, then studied accounting on weekends, believing that if I could just keep us afloat long enough, we could build something together. People said I was foolish for working so hard. They didn't know I was laying bricks for a foundation that would one day carry generations. Sacrifice became my second nature. When Michael was born, I left my job as a secretary at the bank, even though I was good at it, even though my supervisor begged me to stay. Family comes first, I told myself, rocking him through colicky nights. Richard worked long hours, sometimes leaving before dawn and returning after midnight. I cooked, cleaned, balanced the books, and quietly began experimenting with small business ideas. I sold handmade soaps at church fairs, stitched aprons for neighbors, and later, started a bookkeeping service for local shops. Every dollar I made, I tucked away in a savings account under my name. Not because I didn't trust Richard, but because I understood something no one else around me did: women needed their own safety nets. I never bragged, never boasted. I just worked. Silent, steady, invisible, like the roots of a tree. By the time Richard's first startup failed, my small savings had grown enough to keep us from losing the house. He came home one evening, shoulders heavy, face pale, ready to tell me everything was gone. I held his hands and told him the truth: "We're not done. I've been saving. We'll try again. He looked at me with a mix of awe and shame. That night, he swore he would never underestimate me again. After the funeral, the days blended together in a haze of grief and silence, but the sting of Tessa's words didn't fade. If anything, they grew sharper as her behavior became bolder. It was as if humiliating me once had given her permission to do it again. She began to treat me not just with disdain, but with open hostility, and Michael, my son, the boy I had once rocked to sleep, seemed blind to it. At Sunday dinners, she would make little jabs about my old-fashioned recipes, sneering at the casseroles and pies I'd perfected over decades. "You know, Eleanor," she would say in front of everyone, "nobody eats this kind of food anymore. It's unhealthy and, well, kind of depressing." Laughter would trickle around the table, though it was awkward, uncertain. Michael said nothing. He just kept eating, as if silence made him innocent. One evening, while I was helping clear the plates, I overheard her in the kitchen whispering to Michael, though her whisper wasn't quiet enough. "Your mom should really stop coming every week. It makes us look provincial. People talk, you know. They think it's weird we still have her around so much." My heart clenched as I froze by the sink, plate in hand, listening to my own child agree. "Maybe you're right," Michael said softly. "She doesn't really fit in with our crowd." My crowd. My son had a crowd now, and I was no longer part of it. I stood there, invisible, as if the decades I'd spent raising him, protecting him, and sacrificing for him meant nothing. The tears stung, but I refused to let them fall. Not in front of her. Not in front of him. The pattern grew. Holidays became another battlefield. At Christmas, I brought carefully wrapped gifts for my grandchildren, choosing each one with love. Tessa rolled her eyes when the children tore into books and puzzles instead of the flashing electronics she preferred. "Oh, Eleanor," she laughed, "kids don't want this kind of stuff anymore. You really don't get modern parenting, do you?" My grandchildren hesitated, unsure whether to thank me or apologize for not looking thrilled. I knelt by them, whispering, "Books are treasures, sweetheart. They'll take you anywhere." But even as I spoke, I saw Tessa's satisfied smirk. She was winning, reshaping my family in her image, erasing me piece by piece. Even the smaller moments carried barbs. Once, when I wore a pearl brooch Richard had given me on our 25th anniversary, Tessa glanced at it with disdain. "That's quaint," she said. "Do you ever think of updating your style? It might make you feel younger." I smiled politely, though my hands trembled as I adjusted the brooch. I wanted to tell her that Richard's gift was priceless, that it carried the memory of his love, but I swallowed the words. I knew she wouldn't understand. She lived in a world where value was measured by brand names and social approval, not by sentiment or sacrifice. Her dismissiveness wasn't just ignorance, it was cruelty dressed as casual conversation. Slowly, I noticed how her influence seeped into Michael's behavior. He stopped calling me on weekdays, saying he was too busy. He stopped asking for my advice, though he still used my money when emergencies arose. At family gatherings, he would sigh if I told old stories, as if I were embarrassing him. Once, when I corrected a detail about the company's early days, he cut me off with a sharp, "Mom, you don't have to take credit for everything. Dad was the one who built Whitman Freight." The words sliced through me. I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to reveal the truth, that without me, there would have been no company at all. But I stayed silent. Not because I was weak, but because I still believed silence was the shield Richard had taught me to carry. Isolation crept in like a cold draft through the walls. Friends from church began inviting me less, whispering that they heard from Tessa how difficult I could be. Relatives who once leaned on me for advice now bypassed me, going straight to Michael and Tessa, as if I were already fading from relevance. I spent nights alone in my quiet house, staring at the framed photographs of Richard, of Michael as a child, of a family that once felt whole. I told myself I didn't need validation from them, but the ache of loneliness gnawed at me, sharper with every dismissal, every mocking smile. Sacrifice had made me invisible. And invisibility, I was learning, could become a prison. Yet not everyone turned against me. My niece, Clara, often called to check in. She had been at the funeral, and she had heard Tessa's words. "Aunt Eleanor," she told me one evening, Don't let her break you. You're stronger than she knows. Clara reminded me of myself at her age, fierce, determined, unwilling to be silenced. And there were others too, old friends from the early days of Whitman Freight, retired employees who still sent Christmas cards thanking me for what I had done. They saw me. They remembered. Their loyalty was a quiet lifeline in a world that wanted me erased. Still, the cruelty didn't stop. One afternoon, when I stopped by unannounced with homemade soup because Michael had a cold, Tessa met me at the door with crossed arms. "We don't need this," she said coldly. "Michael has me. We don't want to depend on you anymore." She took the soup, then placed it on the porch without even opening the lid. I stood there, shivering in the winter air, as she closed the door in my face. The click of the lock echoed louder than any insult she had ever thrown. It wasn't just about the soup. It was about shutting me out, cutting me off from the son I had raised, the family I had built. For the first time, I felt the full weight of abandonment from the very people I had given everything to. But grief and humiliation can forge steel where there was once only flesh. That night, as I sat alone at my kitchen table, I thought of Richard's words again: "Never let anyone mistake your humility for weakness." My hands curled into fists. For too long, I had let Tessa's cruelty pass unchecked, believing patience was strength. But patience had only emboldened her. She thought she had won. She thought she had erased me. She couldn't have been more wrong. The truth was, I had been holding back. I had power she couldn't fathom, resources she couldn't dream of, and a resolve she had never seen. I was done being silent. I was done being invisible. It was time to remind them who they were dealing with. As the days passed, I began to see their behavior with new clarity. Every insult, every slight, every betrayal, it wasn't just cruelty. It was evidence. Evidence that they had taken my sacrifices for granted, that they had mistaken my humility for weakness. I realized I wasn't just fighting for respect anymore. I was fighting for my dignity, for the truth of my life, for the legacy Richard and I had built. And I wasn't going to let Tessa destroy it. As I folded Richard's old letters that evening, sliding them back into their box, I whispered to myself, "Enough." My voice was steady, stronger than it had been in years. I was done being everyone's doormat. It was time to remind them exactly who Eleanor Grace Whitman really was. The shift inside me was subtle but undeniable. For years, I had endured in silence, but now I found myself observing differently. I no longer let Tessa's words wash over me. I caught them, studied them, tucked them away like evidence in a file. Every careless insult, every manipulative whisper to Michael, every smug glance became a clue. She thought she was untouchable, but I had lived long enough to know that arrogance was usually a mask for fragility. I began to watch her carefully, not as a victim, but as a strategist. My years in business had taught me that information was power. And Tessa, in her vanity, left trails everywhere. All I had to do was follow them. It began innocently enough, with a conversation at the office. Though I rarely visited the headquarters of Whitman Freight these days, preferring to let the younger executives manage daily affairs, I still held the authority of majority owner. One afternoon, I stopped by under the guise of reviewing quarterly reports. My assistant, Hannah, a sharp-eyed woman who had been loyal to me for decades, closed the door behind us and leaned in. "Mrs. Whitman," she said softly, "I wasn't sure if I should tell you, but Tessa's been making waves around here." I raised an eyebrow, motioning for her to continue. "She's been missing deadlines, charging expenses that don't add up, and frankly, alienating clients. Some of the staff are afraid to speak up because of her connection to Michael." My heart tightened. I had suspected incompetence, but hearing it confirmed lit a spark. Hannah slid a folder across the desk. "I thought you should see this." Inside were printouts of emails, billing discrepancies, and client complaints. The pattern was clear. Tessa was careless and reckless, and she thought no one would notice. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, Hannah's folder spread before me like a puzzle. Each piece revealed more about Tessa than she realized. She had been charging spa visits and designer shopping trips to company accounts. She had ignored multiple warnings about overdue contracts. One email even showed her berating a client for questioning her authority. I shook my head slowly, remembering how she mocked me for being classless at the funeral. She had no idea what real class was: respect, humility, accountability. My fingers traced Richard's old fountain pen resting beside me. For years, I had signed contracts that built an empire. Soon, that same pen might sign away Tessa's illusions of power. Still, I didn't rush. Timing mattered. A lesson learned in business and in life: a trap is most effective when the prey doesn't see it until it's too late. In the days that followed, I began gathering more information discreetly. I contacted old friends in the industry, men and women who remembered when Richard and I had first clawed our way into the logistics market. "Tell me," I asked over coffee or quiet phone calls, "what's the word about my daughter-in-law?" The responses were strikingly similar. Laughter, sighs, then hushed warnings. "She's reckless, Eleanor," one former client confided. "She treats meetings like fashion shows and negotiations like social games. We've considered moving our account elsewhere." Another admitted, "We only stay out of respect for you. If not for your name, we'd be long gone." Each word fueled the fire inside me. Tessa wasn't just rude, she was jeopardizing everything Richard and I had built. And Michael, blinded by loyalty or perhaps by fear, wasn't stopping her. It was clear to me now: if I didn't act, Whitman Freight would suffer. And I refused to let my life's work crumble at the hands of arrogance. But information alone wasn't enough. I needed proof that could withstand denial, manipulation, and the inevitable sob story she would weave when confronted. So, I enlisted Clara. My niece had a way of blending into rooms, of hearing things others tried to hide. She was sharp, tech-savvy, and most importantly, she believed in me when no one else did. One afternoon, I invited her to tea at my house. As we sipped from delicate china cups, I explained what I had discovered. Her eyes widened, then narrowed with determination. "Aunt Eleanor," she said, setting her cup down firmly, "I'll help you. I've seen the way she treats you, and it makes me sick. She doesn't deserve any of this." Together, we devised a plan. Clara would discreetly monitor Tessa's social media, track her spending habits, and keep tabs on her activities. It didn't take long before the evidence piled higher. Photos of expensive trips labeled as business travel. Luxury purchases timed suspiciously close to company reimbursements. Nights out with friends while client deadlines languished. Tessa's vanity was her undoing. Every photo, every post was another nail in her coffin. As the picture of Tessa's recklessness came into sharper focus, I also began to uncover her vulnerabilities. It turned out she had racked up significant personal debt before marrying Michael. Credit cards, loans, even a repossessed car. She had hidden it well, but a few calls to old acquaintances revealed the truth. She married up, one former neighbor told me bluntly. Michael saved her from drowning. She wasn't always walking around in designer heels, you know. Back then, she was desperate. That desperation, I realized, still lived beneath her polished exterior. It explained her obsession with appearances, her cruelty toward me, her constant need to prove she was superior. She feared being seen for what she truly was: fragile, insecure, ordinary. And that fear drove her to build walls of arrogance so high she couldn't see the cracks forming beneath her feet. I thought often of Richard during this time. I imagined what he would say if he saw how Tessa treated me, how Michael allowed it, how the company we built was being endangered. "Be patient, Ellie," he would probably advise, "but don't let them destroy what we worked for." Patience, yes. But I also knew patience without action was surrender. So, I balanced both. I continued to attend Sunday dinners, listening quietly as Tessa mocked my food or criticized my clothes, all the while knowing her secrets sat in neat folders at my home. I smiled when she smirked, nodded when she laughed at me, all while storing away every careless word. She thought she was winning. She thought she was erasing me. In reality, she was digging herself deeper into a pit she wouldn't escape. The most damning evidence came unexpectedly. Clara forwarded me a series of messages Tessa had exchanged with a colleague. Messages dripping with disdain not only for me, but for the company itself. "Whitman Freight is old news," she wrote. "Once I convince Michael to sell his shares, I'll finally be free of this dinosaur business. We deserve better than this boring legacy." My breath caught as I read her words. Free of this dinosaur business. She wasn't just incompetent. She was actively plotting against us, against the company Richard and I had built from nothing. The betrayal burned hotter than any insult she had ever hurled at me. She wasn't mocking just a dress. She was mocking decades of sacrifice, the legacy of my husband, the future of my grandchildren. That was the moment I knew there was no turning back. Tessa had declared war, even if she didn't realize it. And I was ready to fight. With evidence in hand, I began preparing carefully. I reached out to the board members of Whitman Freight, arranging private conversations one by one. Over cups of coffee and quiet dinners, I shared pieces of what I had gathered. Not everything, yet, but enough to plant doubt, enough to make them question Tessa's role. Most nodded gravely, some even offering their support outright. "We've trusted you for years, Eleanor," one board member said. "If you say she's a liability, we believe you." Their faith bolstered me. It reminded me that despite Tessa's attempts to erase me, I still held weight, I still commanded respect. I wasn't invisible. Not to those who mattered. By the time I closed the last folder one evening, the fire in my chest had transformed into resolve. I had gathered enough to dismantle Tessa's illusions of superiority piece by piece. She thought her beauty and arrogance shielded her, but she hadn't accounted for the woman she mocked at a funeral, the woman in the black dress she called cheap. She didn't realize that woman had spent a lifetime mastering patience, sacrifice, and strategy. As I slid the folders into my desk drawer, I whispered into the quiet of my home, "Armed with this information, I'm ready." My voice was steady, unshakable. Tessa had no idea what was coming. But soon, she would learn that Eleanor Grace Whitman was not a woman to be mocked, dismissed, or erased. She was a woman who had built an empire, and she was about to teach everyone a lesson they would never forget. The beauty of strategy is that the first move often looks like nothing at all. I didn't storm into rooms with folders of evidence. I didn't demand justice or shout accusations. No, I began quietly, like a gardener pruning an overgrown rosebush. A snip here, a trim there, nothing dramatic at first glance. But over time, the shape became clear, and the thorns were removed with precision. Tessa prided herself on being dramatic, on seizing attention with her laughter and cruelty. That would be her downfall. She was always loud, always obvious. I would be the opposite. Invisible. Patient. A shadow tightening around her until she realized too late she had walked straight into my web. My first step was disarmingly simple: kindness. It disoriented her. One Sunday, as she mocked my mashed potatoes in front of Michael and the children, I smiled warmly and said, "You're right, dear. Perhaps you could show me how you prefer them next time." Her mouth opened slightly in surprise. She expected defensiveness, tears, or silence. Instead, she found herself holding a weapon with no target. Michael glanced at me with something almost like gratitude, though he said nothing. I could see Tessa's confusion flicker across her face. By leaning into her cruelty with grace, I took away its sting. And while she smirked, pretending she had one, I watched her carefully. Every reaction was another piece of information, another step closer to the trap snapping shut. Meanwhile, I began laying groundwork at the company. I made myself more visible, appearing at board meetings I had once skipped, engaging with staff I hadn't spoken to in months. Just keeping an eye on things, I would say with a gentle smile. But in truth, I was weaving threads of loyalty back to me, threads Tessa had neglected in her arrogance. I listened to concerns, offered advice, even remembered small details about people's lives: birthdays, children, hobbies. Tessa thought her designer handbags impressed people. What truly impressed them was being seen, being valued. And soon, they began to talk. Whispers reached me of her missed deadlines, her dismissive comments, her growing unpopularity. She thought she was climbing, but she was already sliding. I simply offered the slope. The second step was to let her dig deeper on her own. Clara's updates became increasingly damning. Tessa posted photos from rooftop bars, captioned with hashtags about business meetings, even as invoices lay ignored on her desk. She flaunted shopping trips while company funds mysteriously dwindled. She bragged online about her influence, calling herself the future of Whitman Freight, not realizing that future was already slipping away. Each careless post was like a breadcrumb leading straight to her downfall. I saved them all, neatly organized in dated folders. If the day came when she tried to twist the truth, I would have more than enough to show the world exactly who she was. But the trap needed more than evidence. It needed timing, an audience, and the perfect stage. That opportunity arrived in the form of the company's annual gala. Every year, Whitman Freight hosted an elegant evening for its partners, clients, and board members. It was Richard's tradition, one he considered vital to maintaining goodwill and prestige. Since his passing, the responsibility had shifted to Michael, and by extension Tessa. I knew she would see the gala as her chance to shine, to flaunt her imagined superiority. Which made it the perfect place to let her mask slip. A public stage, filled with those who mattered most, where her arrogance would be impossible to hide. I didn't need to humiliate her myself. I simply needed to ensure the right spotlight was on her when she inevitably stumbled. In preparation, I became deliberate with my silence. I let her believe I was retreating again, fading into the background. At family dinners, I listened more than I spoke, nodding at her jabs, smiling at her boasts. I knew she was telling herself, the old woman has finally given up. It was almost amusing, watching her grow careless in her overconfidence. Michael, too, seemed to relax, relieved at the apparent peace. That was the beauty of subtlety. No one suspects the storm when the sky looks clear. Inside, though, I was sharper than ever. I met quietly with allies, board members, longtime clients, even a few journalists. I reminded them of Richard's legacy, of my role in building the company, of the importance of preserving its integrity. I didn't mention Tessa outright. I didn't need to. Her actions spoke for themselves, and I was simply ensuring people were listening when she exposed herself. The children became my quiet anchor during this time. Little Sarah, with her soft hands tugging at mine, and James, with his endless questions about Grandpa Richard. They were innocent in all this, yet they reminded me why I couldn't afford to stay silent. This wasn't just about revenge, though that desire burned strong. It was about legacy. About ensuring that when my grandchildren grew up, they inherited not a broken name sullied by arrogance, but a foundation built on strength and respect. I began keeping a journal, recording every detail of this chapter of our family's history. One day, I would hand it to them, so they would know the truth, not the warped story Tessa tried to tell, but the reality of their grandmother's fight. As the gala drew closer, I set the final piece of the trap, an introduction. I arranged for Clara to quietly send invitations to a few influential figures Tessa had alienated. Former clients, disgruntled associates, even a rival business leader she once mocked publicly. They hadn't planned on attending, but the promise of a Whitman gala was too tempting to resist. Tessa, busy obsessing over gowns and photographers, had no idea she was about to walk into a room filled not just with admirers, but with skeptics waiting for her to slip. All I had to do was watch, and wait for gravity to take its course. The night before the gala, I sat alone in my study, Richard's portrait gazing down at me. I poured myself a glass of wine and whispered into the stillness, "Tomorrow, my love, the game begins." It wasn't triumph I felt, not yet. It was anticipation, the kind that tightens your chest and sharpens your senses. I thought of Tessa, preening in front of mirrors, convinced the night would cement her place at the top. She had no idea the ground beneath her was hollow. By the time she realized, it would be too late. And I, Eleanor Grace Whitman, the widow she mocked, the woman she tried to erase, would be there to watch her fall. I went to bed that night not as a victim, but as a strategist. The trap was set. The stage was ready. And soon, everyone would see who Tessa really was. The ballroom shimmered that evening, chandeliers throwing golden light across velvet drapes and polished floors. Waiters floated by with trays of champagne, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. The Whitman Freight annual gala had always been Richard's pride, a night of elegance and respect. This year, it carried a different weight. Richard was gone, and Tessa had seized the reins. She glided into the room in a glittering silver gown, smiling like a movie star, soaking in the attention. Michael walked beside her, looking weary but compliant. Guests turned their heads, whispering. I stood at the top of the staircase, my black dress simple but striking, watching. My heart pounded not with fear, but with clarity. Tonight, masks would fall. Tonight, my silence would end. Tessa wasted no time making herself the center of the evening. She tapped her champagne glass with a spoon, drawing all eyes. "Good evening, everyone," she announced, her voice dripping with confidence. "As you know, I've been working tirelessly to carry forward Richard's legacy. Tonight is proof that Whitman Freight is in good hands." Her smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. I noticed the flicker of nerves in her hand as she adjusted her bracelet. It was small, but telling. She knew some were unconvinced, and her vanity demanded that she win them over. She was desperate for validation. And desperation always cracks under pressure. I drifted among the guests, greeting familiar faces. Old board members clasped my hand warmly. A retired driver hugged me tightly, whispering, "It's good to see you here again, Mrs. Whitman. Things haven't felt right without you." Their words reminded me that I wasn't walking into this battle alone. People remembered. They respected. And most importantly, they were watching. I didn't need to orchestrate Tessa's downfall. She was already rehearsing it herself. I was merely arranging the spotlight. As the evening unfolded, small fissures began to show. A client approached Tessa about a missed payment, his voice raised enough to draw attention. She laughed it off, blaming administrative hiccups, but her eyes flashed with irritation. Later, a board member asked about quarterly numbers. She stumbled, giving vague answers, her smile strained. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. I remained quiet, standing near the edge of conversations, my presence a silent reminder of the standard she could never reach. Every time she faltered, eyes flicked to me, searching for reassurance. I gave them nothing but a calm, steady gaze. The confrontation itself arrived in the most unexpected way. During dinner, one of the journalists I'd invited, a sharp-eyed woman named Diane, stood to ask a question. "Mrs. Whitman," she began, her voice clear, "you've spoken a lot tonight about your leadership. Could you share some specifics? For instance, how do you explain the sudden rise in operating expenses under your oversight?" The room hushed. Tessa froze, caught like a deer in headlights. Then she forced a laugh. "Oh, you know how these things go. Business can be unpredictable." Diane didn't blink. Unpredictable, yes. But sources suggest funds have been diverted for personal spending. Care to clarify? Gasps echoed across the tables. Tessa's smile cracked, and for the first time, true panic flickered in her eyes. Michael shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening on his glass. "That's enough," he muttered, but his voice carried no weight. The damage was already done. Guests leaned in, whispering furiously. Tessa tried to recover, snapping, "Those accusations are baseless. I've given everything to this company." Her voice rose, sharp and defensive. The mask was slipping. And that was my cue. I stood slowly, the chair sliding back with a quiet scrape that drew every eye. My heart was steady now, my voice calm but carrying through the room. "Tessa is right about one thing," I said. "She has given everything, to herself. And it's time the truth came to light." All eyes turned to me. Tessa's face drained of color, then flushed red. "What are you doing?" she hissed. But I didn't look at her. I looked at the room, the people who had trusted my family for decades. "Many of you know me," I continued. "I stood by Richard as he built this company from the ground up. I know every mile our trucks have traveled, every deal that kept food on the tables of our employees. This legacy was never about glittering gowns or flashy speeches. It was about integrity, sacrifice, and respect. And lately, that legacy has been tarnished." Gasps, nods, murmurs. It spread through the room like fire. Tessa tried to interrupt, her voice shrill. "You're lying. You're jealous of me." But her desperation only made her look smaller. I reached into my bag and placed a neat folder on the table. "These are financial records," I said evenly. "Proof of misused company funds. Proof of negligence. Proof of arrogance disguised as leadership." I didn't slam it down or wave it dramatically. I simply let the weight of it sit there, visible for anyone who wished to look. Tessa has spent months ridiculing me, mocking me as an old woman in cheap dresses. What she didn't realize is that humility isn't weakness. It's strength. And tonight, you'll see the difference. The silence was deafening. Tessa lunged forward, snatching at the folder, but Diane intercepted it, flipping it open and scanning the documents. Her sharp intake of breath was enough. "These are damning," she whispered, just loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. Whispers turned to open stares. Board members exchanged looks. One cleared his throat. "Is this true, Mrs. Whitman?" he asked Tessa directly. She stammered, her confidence shattering. I don't know anything about this." It was the final crack in her carefully crafted image. The mighty silver gown, the practiced smile, the cruel words, all of it crumbled into dust under the weight of truth. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply stood taller, my hands steady. "This company is more than one person's vanity project," I said. "It belongs to every worker who drives the trucks, every family that depends on us, every partner who trusts our name. And I will not let one woman's arrogance destroy what Richard built." My words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Tessa's lips trembled, her eyes darting wildly around the room for someone to save her. But no one moved. Not even Michael. Especially not Michael. In that moment, the confrontation was complete. I had not shouted. I had not humiliated her with insults. I had simply shown the truth and let it do the work. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, heavy with realization. Everyone understood what they had just witnessed. Tessa wasn't a leader. She was a fraud. And I, Eleanor Grace Whitman, had reclaimed the voice she tried to strip from me. I sat back down, the calmness of victory settling into my bones. Tessa had wanted the spotlight. She had it now. But it was burning her alive. And as I watched her crumble, I knew one thing with certainty: this was only the beginning. Years of disrespect, years of cruelty. This night was just the first repayment. Tessa had played her game loudly and carelessly. Now it was my turn. And I intended to play to the very end. The morning after the gala, the silence in Michael and Tessa's home must have been unbearable. Though I wasn't there, I could imagine the tension. Her voice sharp, his quiet anger simmering. By sunrise, the news had already spread. Diane's article hit the local paper before breakfast, complete with photographs of Tessa's frozen face beside the words "Financial Misconduct Allegations Rock Whitman Freight." Phone calls began pouring in from clients, board members and employees. And for the first time in months, they weren't asking for Tessa. They were asking for me. The reckoning had begun, not with fireworks, but with steady, undeniable clarity. Michael came to me first. He appeared on my doorstep before noon, looking 10 years older than he had the night before. His tie hung loose, his hair uncombed. "Mother," he began, his voice strained, "why didn't you tell me?" There was no accusation in his tone, only sorrow. I led him into the kitchen, poured him coffee, and sat across from him. "Because you weren't ready to hear it," I replied softly. "You let her speak for you, live for you. If I had told you, you would have defended her. You had to see it for yourself." He covered his face with his hands. "She's ruined everything." I placed my hand over his, steady and warm. "No, Michael. She only ruined her own mask. The company, our family, our legacy, they're still here. And now, it's up to us to protect them." Not everyone was so quick to align themselves. My daughter-in-law's allies, shallow as they were, tried to spin the story. One cousin called me vindictive. Another muttered that I was too dramatic for airing family business publicly. But their words carried no weight. The evidence was too strong, the witnesses too many. Slowly, the tide shifted. People who once nodded along to Tessa's gossip began avoiding her calls. Friends who once admired her handbags now whispered about her disgrace. The more she flailed, the more isolated she became. And with each passing day, my silence grew louder than her denials. The board convened an emergency meeting 3 days later. I walked into the conference room wearing the same black dress she had mocked at the funeral. This time, no one laughed. Instead, Chairs scraped back as members stood respectfully. "Mrs. Whitman," one said, "we're relieved you're here." Tessa sat across the table, her face pale, her voice brittle as glass. "This is ridiculous. She's manipulating all of you." But when the records were passed around, when Clara's compiled evidence was displayed on the projector, her protests dissolved into stammers. One by one, votes were cast. Unanimous. Effective immediately, Tessa was removed from her position. The gavel struck, and just like that, the crown she had stolen crumbled to dust. Afterward, an older driver named Hank approached me in the lobby. He had been with the company since Richard's early days, his hands calloused from decades of work. Tears brimmed in his eyes as he said, "Mrs. Whitman, it's like he's here again. You've brought him back." His words pierced me deeper than any boardroom victory could. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about restoration. About showing every man and woman who built this company that their sacrifices were not in vain. That the Whitman name still meant something honorable. For the first time since Richard's death, I felt his presence beside me, steadying me proud. But the reckoning wasn't only professional. It rippled through the family like an earthquake. At Sunday dinner, the children sensed the change even before the adults spoke. Little Sarah crawled into my lap, whispering, "Grandma, are you happy now?" I kissed her forehead, holding her close. Across the table, Michael's shoulders slumped with shame, while Tessa's chair remained empty. James, wise beyond his years, looked at his father and asked plainly, "Daddy, why did you let Mom be so mean to Grandma?" The silence that followed was painful but necessary. Sometimes children ask the questions adults are too cowardly to face. And in that silence, Michael finally began to see the cost of his passivity. Tessa didn't vanish quietly. She tried clawing back scraps of dignity, filing appeals, threatening lawsuits, even cornering relatives with sob stories. But each attempt only deepened her humiliation. At one point, she stormed into my house, eyes wild, shouting, "You destroyed me." I stood calmly in the doorway and replied, "No, Tessa. You destroyed yourself. I simply stopped cleaning up the pieces." She trembled, rage and despair colliding, before storming off into the night. Watching her retreat, I felt no triumph, no cruelty. Only pity. She was a woman who had mistaken vanity for value, cruelty for strength. And in losing everything, she had been given her first real chance to learn. Whether she would take it was her choice alone. Meanwhile, the people who had once underestimated me began to see me differently. Neighbors stopped me on walks to say how proud they were. Employees I hadn't spoken to in years sent letters thanking me for protecting their jobs. Even estranged relatives began calling, seeking reconciliation. It was strange, after so long of being dismissed as old or out of touch, to suddenly be seen as a force again. But I accepted it with humility, reminding myself of Richard's words, "Power isn't about noise, Eleanor. It's about steadiness." I hadn't shouted to be heard. I had simply stood firm, and in doing so, the world adjusted its ears. As the dust settled, I knew the reckoning was more than just Tessa's downfall. It was the family's awakening. Michael began stepping into his role with newfound seriousness, no longer content to let others dictate his path. The children learned what integrity looked like, not from lectures, but from watching truth play out in real time. And I remembered myself. Not just as Richard's widow or Michael's mother or Tessa's target, but as Eleanor Grace Whitman. A woman who had sacrificed, endured, and finally risen. The reckoning had restored not just the company, but my place within it, and within my family. And yet, as I sat in the quiet of my study that evening, sipping tea beneath Richard's portrait, I knew one truth above all: this story wasn't ending here. It was only shifting chapters. Justice had been served, but healing still lay ahead. Boundaries would need to be drawn, forgiveness weighed, futures rebuilt. As I closed my journal, I wrote the final line for the day: "The storm has passed, but the rebuilding begins tomorrow." Because reckoning is not the end. It is the turning point. And tomorrow, the new beginning would dawn. The morning light poured through the lace curtains of my kitchen, casting gentle patterns on the worn oak table. It was the same table where I had served Richard his coffee every morning for 40 years, but today it felt different. Across from me sat my grandchildren, Sarah and James, their heads bent over crayons and paper, laughter bubbling from them like a fresh spring. The heaviness that had once choked this house was gone. No sharp words, no anxious silence, no mocking tones. Only peace. The house, for the first time in years, breathed with me. Michael arrived shortly after, his steps hesitant, as though unsure if he had the right to walk freely in his mother's home. He wore no tie, no armor of corporate formality. Only an open collared shirt, sleeves rolled, hands empty. He paused in the doorway, eyes scanning the room as if searching for permission. "Mother," he said, voice low but steady. I looked at him, and for a heartbeat, he was once again the boy who used to run barefoot through the yard, scraped knees and wild laughter. He lowered himself into a chair across from me, his shoulders slumping. "I failed you. I let her use me, speak for me, silence me. I let her tear this family apart. And I stood by while she hurt you. I'm ashamed." His voice broke, and for the first time in a long while, I saw the truth in his eyes, remorse, raw and unguarded. I reached across the table, placing my hand gently over his. "We all stumble, Michael," I said softly. "What matters is whether we stay on the ground or get back up. You're here now. That's what counts." His fingers curled tightly around mine, like a child's desperate grip. Tears welled in his eyes, but this time, he didn't hide them. He whispered, "I want to make this right. I want to be the son you deserve." The weeks that followed were filled with slow rebuilding. Michael worked side by side with the loyal employees who had stood by me during the darkest days. Together, they brought Whitman Freight back to its roots: integrity, fairness, and family. For the first time in years, the boardroom wasn't a battleground, but a place of unity. Workers greeted me with respect, not fear, their voices lighter, their eyes brighter. Richard's legacy was alive again, not in stone buildings or balance sheets, but in the people who carried his values forward. At home, Sunday dinners returned. The dining room, once silenced by tension, now rang with laughter. Sarah proudly recited her poems, James showed off his drawings, and Michael, no longer weighed down by shame, spoke freely, his voice strong and warm. We passed bread, shared stories, and for the first time in too long, I felt like a family matriarch instead of a ghost in my own home. Even Tessa's absence carried a strange kind of peace. She had left, stripped of her power, her arrogance crumbling with every truth revealed. Yet, I heard whispers that she was trying to rebuild elsewhere, perhaps even reflecting on the woman she had become. I held no bitterness for her. She was not my responsibility anymore. My lesson had been delivered, and what she chose to do with it was her own cross to bear. One evening, as the sun sank behind the horizon, Sarah curled up beside me on the porch swing. "Grandma," she said, resting her head on my shoulder, "you're the strongest person I know." I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Strength isn't about shouting the loudest or winning every fight, sweetheart. Sometimes it's about standing tall when others try to push you down, and never forgetting who you are." Her eyes sparkled with understanding, and I knew that the lesson would stay with her long after I was gone. Life had shifted, not back to what it once was, but into something new, something truer. I found myself painting again, joining a book club, even taking short trips I had always put off. I was no longer living only for others, but for myself as well. It wasn't selfish, it was survival. It was joy. As I looked around at my family, healed, humbled, and whole, I felt Richard's presence with me, not as a haunting weight but as a quiet warmth. He had trusted me to carry the torch when the storm came, and I had done so, not with rage but with resilience. Sometimes the world mistakes silence for weakness, but silence can be the deepest well of strength. And I, Eleanor Grace Whitman, had proven that quiet strength can move mountains, heal wounds, and restore families. This was not the end of my story, it was the dawn of a new beginning. My love, did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story.